welcome to our second edition of Support Local Art, the talk series supported by Nations Trust Bank Private Banking. In this conversation, we will discuss the role of curator in the Sri Lankan art landscape. And we have with us today 4 established curators. And in this conversation, we will discuss key projects in an effort to define this role in Sri Lanka today. I will begin the conversation by introducing our panelists. Sharmini Pereira, the Chief Curator of the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka, founder and director of Raking Leaves Publishing, and co-founder of the Archive of Sri Lankan Contemporary Art, Design and Architecture. Hasini Haputhanthri, independent researcher, museologist and curator. Shayari de Silva, curator of Jeffrey Bava Trust, Art and Archival Collections. Sandev Handy, and architect, Sandev Handy, artist and assistant curator of the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Sri Lanka, a member of the Packet Collective, co-curator of the House of Kal residency. I would like to begin the conversation with you, Sharmini, at a particular moment in time in 1994, when you curated an exhibition at the National Gallery in Colombo. And this exhibition, I think, is a really interesting point to begin this conversation, as I think it really begins a very interesting path for curating in Sri Lanka. Of course, your work being a very important reference in the role of curator as a curator was established, a Sri Lankan curator was established internationally. But I think this particular exhibition bringing us forward to your work today as Chief Curator of the museum shows a very interesting path in this role that you have dedicated your work to. Can you give us a little bit more information on that particular exhibition and walk us through your work as curator since?
Thank you, Saskia, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation today with Sandev, with Hasini, and with Shayari. I'd love it if Marsha could share the image, which is, I have to confess, the only image I have of the exhibition that Saskia is referring to, which was the first ever exhibition that I curated. And it's a photograph that I just came across, in fact, this weekend while sorting out books and getting ready to throw them away, in fact, and then this fell out. And to my surprise, I realized that it was a photograph that I had taken in 1993, and I was 24 or 23, no, I was 23. So I'm behind the camera, and it shows you a picture which in the middle ground, you have Thenura to the right, Chandragupta Thenura, and Jagat Veerasinghe to the left. And in front of Jagat is a woman called Sisi, who was taking classes at VAFA, and this was the first venue where VAFA began. And in the background there is, I think, Sunil Vijay Siriwardana, I think. He was very involved with VAFA at the outset. So I'm showing you this photograph as a starting point to talk about the show that I curated in 1994. The image was taken in 1993, and the following year, New Approaches in Contemporary Sri Lanka Art opened. And it was an exhibition that I worked really closely with Jagat and Thenura on. And in so many ways, I suppose it was paradigmatic for me in terms of working with artists. And Jagat and Thenu really shaped and formed who I became as a curator and the artist that I then went on to work with, not just in Sri Lanka. But as I say, this is the only record of that exhibition. What I can tell you about it is that it opened in 1994, and it opened at the National Art Gallery. And at that time, I was very keen for it to open at a government institution. I think at that time in particular, I was very taken up with the idea that there was a museum called the National Art Gallery, and that there was a category of national art somewhere in existence. And I wanted it to be there because it was also a place up until then where I had gone to see so many different kinds of exhibitions and funerals and things that had nothing most of the time to do with art. So it was a bit of an interesting conversation, because I have to mention this exhibition was funded by the British Council, and they were really keen to have it in their premises. And the person that in fact gave me the funding for it was Ranmali Merchandani. And Ranmali conceded and said, okay, go ahead, have it at the National Art Gallery. And it was an exhibition that included 6 artists. There was Jagath Thenawara, there was Kingsley Gunathilaka, there was Tilak Samaravikrama, there was Lucky Senanayaka, Tisadi Alvis, and Dravinka Madhavella. I think that's everybody in the list. And I suppose what it was trying to do was set out to look at putting together artists, in the case of Chandragupta Thenawara and Jagath, who hadn't really normally been seen as artists in the same way that a figure like Lucky Senanayaka had. So it was no more than that, just trying to really bring together new approaches. That's quite literally what it was in how we saw art and artists. I have no idea how many people came to see it. Audience didn't really matter then. It's something I've learned it's mattered more and more and more, and it led me, in fact, when much later in my curatorial work to set up, in fact, Raking Leaves, because I was so interested in audience. But this exhibition, I can only recall how we had people coming in who included the army, because I remember one of the works by Tisadi Alvis was using a toy AK-47 as a mobile. So they were very intrigued by this, and they kept kind of coming in one after the other to look at it. I think perhaps what was important for me in this exhibition, other than it being the first time I'd curated, was the people that I came into contact with. So other than people like Ranmali, on the funding side, there was an amazing man who was in Colombo then called Bernard Steinrucker. And Bernard went on, he was at the Deutsche Bank, and he literally opened his checkbook for the bank and said, how much money do you want? He was just so engaged with trying to get something off the ground in Sri Lanka, which was then really, we were in the midst of a war then in 1994. And there were people very much like him who were just opening checkbooks and writing checks to get this show off the ground. And to them and their support, that's something that I really want to pay homage to here. There are other people, though, involved in this exhibition as well. And that was the office of an architect called Geoffrey Bower. And I remember knocking on the door of Geoffrey Bower's office, and I didn't really know who he was. I knew he was an architect, and I sat down in his office and explained what I was trying to do. And I wasn't very concise in those days, so I probably spoke for far too long. And I remember him saying someone's name, and this person appeared from the back office, and Mr. Bower said, please help this girl. And that person was Channa Daswata. And Channa quickly got on board. And in fact, when we designed the show, what the architects did is they used plywood that was standing there waiting to kit out somebody's swimming pool. So they brought this plywood on board, and we created a sort of enclosed opening to the one wing of the National Art Gallery. And I remember Albert Dharmasiri coming to the show and saying it felt like a nightclub. Which I guess was a compliment in a kind of backhanded way. But of course, Channa and his architects were really pivotal to the execution of this exhibition. And even at the opening, I remember we had J.R. Jayawardena come as the officiate to open the exhibition. And we asked him to come, in fact, because much of the work in the show, in terms of the work that Jagath was showing in Kingsley and Theanora, was looking at what had happened during 83. And he was in power at that time. What I didn't realize, though, and it was right at the beginning of what was going to be a change of government, is that Mr. Bandaranaike was about to come into power. So that was the other second possibility as a guest of honor, because that was how people did it then. But I remember at the opening, we were also, very unprepared. No one really knew what they were doing. It was all hands on deck. I had paint all over one part of my arm, and I was wearing a sari, and it was the wrong side of the sari, and it was all sort of down one arm. But I remember Amila Demel coming in with a beautifully laundered and ironed white tablecloth, which she very properly put over the table that was where we had catalogues, because the only other thing that was actually a record and produced was a catalogue. So we had this beautiful table with a perfect white tablecloth. I suppose I'd end by saying, it was pivotal for me, this exhibition, because of the relationships, and particularly with artists, with people who I've gone on to work with. Jagath Veerasinghe and Tissa de Alves were two of the artists in the show, and they went on to be artists that I chose to be part of the Asia Pacific Triennial in 1999. But it was this show, in fact, which I really, didn't quite know what I was doing, but I applied afterwards from Sri Lanka to a place which was offering a curatorial studies program, and it was at the Whitney. It was called the Whitney Independent Studies Program. And to my surprise, I got a letter and they offered me a place. I wasn't able to take it because I couldn't pay my way, but I put in an application on the back of that to the Royal College of Art, and I was accepted with sponsorship or with scholarships. And the Royal College of Art was one of the places that was in London starting to teach curatorial studies, and I was the third intake. So it was really something, I suppose, when I look back at this exhibition, that paved the way for me to go on and study something that, obviously, as you've said, I've not really, deterred from in quite a boring old way, but it's also something to say that I've always, I think, felt that my place of work was Sri Lanka. And working here, working with artists from here. And over the years, that's taken very many different forms. So yeah, I think to tie up perhaps with where I am now, and trying to establish something in the form of the museum, feels like a sort of, coming along through a journey that I perhaps, always wished for. And it's wonderful to be able to be in a position, I suppose, that you can do what you're very passionate about. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there in terms of talking about that first exhibition.
Thank you, Sharmini. I think, as you explained, your passion for what you do is something that is no doubt shared by all the panelists here, and why I'm particularly excited to have you all together today, because there are so many cross sections amongst all of your work. And one thing you explained was how you began the designing of this first exhibition, even though it was at a very early stage. And Hasini, in researching your work and your motivation behind studying museology, you focused a lot on the reasoning behind developing a greater understanding of, even designing spaces, but how important that is in communicating something. And I think generally in the role of curator, we often think about putting artworks together, but not necessarily understanding how space also plays such an important role. And I think that's really something that is interesting to talk about in relation to your work specifically, in relation to all of your work. But Hasini, I'd like to come to you with the next question and get a better understanding of why you decided to study museology, And your work expands across writing, online spaces, offline spaces. It's quite diverse, in fact, with a big focus on curating. Can you walk us through some of your projects ongoing and recent projects in to give us a better understanding of your work as a curator?
Thank you, Saskia. It's lovely to be a part of the panel. And I think, like all of us, I had a different route to becoming a curator. It wasn't like I had a straightforward journey of studying art history per se. I was always interested in it, but life takes us on different paths. So my own practice in the arts, in managing cultural projects, not just visual arts, but also performing arts, etc., has always been in a context of peace building and conflict transformation, which is my professional background. And what I've done is to manage a cultural portfolio that focused on conflict transformation, peace building, memory work, transitional justice, with a very strong focus on community approach. So that's where that's the context within which my curatorial practice emerged. So I was always focusing on how to communicate with audiences which are not necessarily the Colombo-centric audience, how to communicate with beyond, and how to work with communities, how to make them part of the processes that's going on. And that's what sort of led me to work on museology. In fact, my own focus on museology developed from studying a lot of Holocaust museums and how museums actually play a critical role in other countries in tackling difficult histories and presenting alternative narratives than the ones that we always find in our museums. So I went on to study museology after a lot of previous practice and professional involvement in a very different field of work. And that's how I sort of approach the subject. So after completing my museology work and returning back to Sri Lanka, my interest was really about understanding where are we at in terms of all the discourses and discussions that are happening globally, and where are we at? So that's when I undertook the study of Museums, Memory and Identity Politics, which is a publication that came out earlier this year, although the research happened about 3-4 years back, where I sort of really tried to assess all the museums that are out there and how they dealt with certain issues that are relevant to us as a country, as a nation right now, and how do we tackle that, along with other issues such as how interactive are we, how are we in terms of a curator. So the most important insight that came out of that research, I would say that most of our practice, except for a few limited nodes in the capital, we have not expanded or caught up with where the discourse is on at a global level. So the idea of a museum is very much something of the past, a very old-fashioned understanding of it. And so is the role of the curator, since we are really talking about curators in this particular session. So, for instance, to begin with, curator is not a word that's familiar unless you really do come from the capital, Colombo, and speak English. Because in Sinhala or even in Tamil, the term that would be used for a curator is not a very familiar word. The Sinhala word is abhirakshaka, which is very high flown, not known to people. So even in the understanding of the role of a curator, what is that person supposed to do? Do we even view it as a career or a career path or a life path? Do young people see this as something important for them to get involved in? So all of these I felt needed a lot of soul searching and a lot of work and a lot of redefining. So the work that I have been trying to do after my return to Sri Lanka, after museology, not before that, but was really about trying to push the general discourse that surrounds museology, museum practice, exhibitioning, and curatorial work from that place where we are right now to a little bit forward, especially among other communities, not just the not just the people who work at a very different level, but also in working with the 100 plus museums that we have across the island. So, I mean, I was surprised that we have such a lot of museums, which means we should have such a lot of curators also in 100 plus museums. There are about 125, 130 museums in the country at the moment. And it'll be so interesting to see how this role of a curator is understood in each of these contexts. Yeah, so that's one way and one major chunk of my work. And the other area has been a lot to do with, again, my own commitment towards working with social inclusion, and really being focused on what we are struggling with as a country right now, and how do we bring these issues into a dialogue space in terms of visual arts, in terms of history, in terms of education, etc. So that has been very much my understanding. Also because I think we are going through a very important phase in our country's historical journey in terms of recovery and finding hope and recognizing our own resilience. And there is a lot of work that needs to happen in terms of capturing, documenting in all sorts of ways what we are going through at the moment for our future generations. So that is where my interest in archiving work, oral history work. I also studied specifically oral history and museums, and how that could work together to make museums more participatory, more community-centered, and more inclusive. How we as curators can be more moving towards a role of taking up the role of a facilitator of a process of bringing different groups together in the creation of an exhibition, let's say, since we are focusing on visual arts here. So for me, a lot of the work is also at conceptual level, trying to push the discourse from where we are and trying to push it forward, especially with the relevance towards what we are going through as a country, its politics, its social diversity, and keeping all of that in mind. And the third element of my work has also been working internationally, because we can, when we are working in a context very as specific as Sri Lanka, I think it's a great context to work with, but we also tend to get siloed. And the other part of my work, especially through the Digital Museum Art Initiative, which is the World Art and Memory Museum, is to really find parallels and start speaking across borders. So that project actually brings together curators from 7 different countries, artists from 7 different countries, again with a focus on issues that I've always been working on, that is of inclusion, peace building, education, history, etc. And how similar we are, and in terms of the issues we have to deal with, how similar our artists are in their expressions, etc. So a lot of that is really building synergies within Sri Lanka, between divided groups, but also internationally across different nations. So that's the kind of work that I'm trying to do at the moment.
Thanks, Hasini, for sharing all of that. That is a lot of work. But I think that I just want to touch on one really interesting point many interesting points, but one particular point that you made about how there is no word for curating in Sinhala. And I think that while you spoke about there being so many museums within Sri Lanka, this role of curator isn't considered an official one. And I think that is also part of the motivation behind this conversation, is to further, expand the understanding of curating locally. Is surprisingly something which is not well understood amongst all communities. And I think that is something which is incredibly important because of the role a curator plays in many senses. And speaking of the online space as well, I think I'm sure all of you have so much to share about how that has actually changed your role, and perhaps it's a conversation for the next talk on curating. But I'm sure that has also changed the way in which you curate, and that brings me to you, Shayari, because you're just sort of wrapping up a really excellent presentation that was a year-long presentation for the Baba 100 centenary celebration, in which you curated a project called The Gift. I know that you presented as much as you could online of this, and it was so very well presented considering the time in which this centenary celebration occurred. Could you share more with us about your work with this particular project and how you came into working with the Trust as curator as well, if you can blend that in?
Thank you, Saskia, for having me as part of this panel. I think these conversations are really vital, and I'm so glad you're taking this initiative. So I, as you mentioned, I'm trained as an architect. I went to liberal arts college not knowing what I wanted to study, thinking maybe I would go through sociology or English literature, and I kind of fell into architecture. And from the very beginning was interested in those spaces in which architecture overlaps with other fields, and especially with the public. And right from my second year as an undergraduate, was working within museums because I found them to be very powerful spaces for making these kinds of engagements and having conversations that I guess as a 20-year-old I was trying to have in my own head, and being able to have that kind of bridge between ideas and objects was always really, really powerful to me. But after, I pursued a master's in architecture and was working as an architect in New York when I decided to move back to Colombo, and it was in 2018. Was wondering what to do, and then a friend, Sean Anderson, who was working at MoMA, said, "Well, I think the Jeffrey Bauer Trust is actually looking for a curator." And it so happened that Chana, who has already featured in these talks, was in New York at the time when we met, and this was really when 2019 marked Jeffrey Bauer's 100th birth anniversary, and they had all these projects sort of already kind of in the pipeline, and they were looking for a curator. Taking a step back, they were also, the trust was established in 1982 by Jeffrey Bauer, and its objectives are really to further and foster architecture, the fine arts, and ecological and environmental studies. And that work had begun, I think, right from that point, first through scholarships, then through exhibitions and talks. Of course, when the architect passed away in 2003, there was a lot of kind of settling of the estate. And I think the trustees felt that this centenary event would be a good moment to kind of galvanize this engagement. And so what we developed was this kind of, like I said, it was a long drawn out project. It was a year long, which is kind of the tempo of a marathon, whereas I feel like a lot of exhibitions and biennales, they have like a sprint-like speed. So it was a very kind of really amazing opportunity for us to then work with opening up the collection in its various parts and begin to engage different audiences. I think Bauer's legacy had a strong following, but we were also very keen to widen that, to kind of bridge the interactions between artists and architects and the general public. If I might share my screen. And it wasn't intended by any means to be a online program, and it actually wasn't right for the first half of it. So it was this whole kind of year-long set of events that was everything from lectures and tours and talks. We were looking at ways in which we could talk about architecture, talk about its relationship to art and objects. So we started with something that was quite simple. It was an installation of decorative arts, objects designed and collected by Bauer at Nuremberg. We had a second exhibition guest curated by a Peruvian architect called Max Moya, who was actually looking at Blakis Renaika's landscape work at the Ina de Silva house. The Gift project, which was one of the events that actually did get impacted by COVID and the ways in which we had to move online, was really building on the traditions of Nuremberg as a space to engage with artists and inspire them. And that is, Nuremberg has a 40-year history of Jeffrey Bauer living in it and designing it, evolving it, which is intertwined with the arts. Everything, Lucky Sana staying, recovering from typhoid, and drawing a mural. And we wanted to build on that. It was also an opportunity to really bring artists, both from Sri Lanka and overseas, into a fairly unusual situation in which they pretty much had free reign, and they responded to a garden in a very long, it took about 2 years really, the process of starting those conversations and then installing. The 5 artists were Chamkut Kenoran, Diana Singh, Dominic Sansoni, Li Ming Wei, and then the architect Kinga Kuma. So it was also this opportunity to look at experimentation and looking at how do we encounter work, and what does the place in which a work is situated, what does that say about the work? How does it affect our reading of it? And then the last project, which would have been in July 2020, but now will open in December, hopefully if COVID, depending on COVID, is this exhibition on the archives. And part of our collections, which I mentioned, so our collections have Jeffrey Bauer's fine arts, decorative arts, library, and then the drawing archive, the archive of the practice, which is an incredibly rich repository. And when I wasn't really hired for Bar 100, I was really hired to look after these collections. And if we kind of think about that word curator really from its Western etymology, it very much is about caretaker. And that is a big part of the work that I do, looking after. We don't at this point have in-house conservators, but there is a lot of coordination with conservation, with framing, all of the things, storage, so it's kind of register element to what we do. And we also do have a fantastic but small team now that is working collectively on this work. So in that process of sort of cataloging the archives and digitizing them, which was ongoing while we were developing and organizing the Bar 100 project, was looking at these incredible drawings that really had never been shown in Sri Lanka. And looking at the kind of, and I'm not showing you a drawing, by the way, just to clarify, the photograph is from the archives, and what you see on the left of it is a rendering of a pavilion that we're going to reinstall for this exhibition. And I think what we're really interested in is the way these archives, by looking back, they actually crystallize a part of Bauer's practice, which was this ability to look back to really be innovative. And that kind of continuum he worked in when it came with the past and the future. And I think personally, my training is very much on art and architectural history, and I do really find that looking back is a productive place to then look forward as well. And I love the way the Bauer's practice does this. And so the exhibition is attempting to take a look at these drawings with that vantage, and really looking at how that practice engaged with place. So that's kind of our upcoming project, which would have been part of Bar 100, but has, in this crazy last 2 years, will now be a standalone project.
Thank you for taking us through those. I'd like to, in the next part of the discussion, really talk more about your work with the foundation and how this sort of cross-section, but we're going to come to that in a minute. I also think it's really interesting the references that we're making to Baba from Sharmini's experience and now you working. So what's nice is bringing you all together and sort of looking back, but also looking to where we are at this moment and making these interesting points, which I do hope we will be able to go a little bit deeper into the second part of this conversation. Sandev, coming over to you, and where we began this conversation really with Sharmini's exhibition in 1994, it also makes me think about the exhibition that you curated at the Sapuma Foundation. And correct me if I'm wrong, that was in 2017 or 2008? 2017?
It's the beginning of 2018.
Beginning 2018. And this was a really interesting exhibition, in my opinion, because it established the importance of curating, but I think also the lack of curating in our Sri Lankan contemporary environment. The exhibition itself, titled Embodying Power, basically worked with, I'm going to let you expand on it, but young contemporary artists. And the way you presented it in the Sapuma Foundation is also very relevant to the show itself. Can you speak a little bit more about your return from the US, which was just a couple of years before this, and how you became very quickly involved in the contemporary art scene? Your work specifically as curator, I know you are involved in various different things as well as artists. As an artist, can you take us through a little bit of the return of your return from the US, and then this exhibition, of course, bringing you, of course, to your work with the museum today?
Yeah, thanks, Saskia. Thank you all for having me here. Sorry, I'm coming to you from the confines of my bedroom, as this is the best place with light in my house. But yes, I think thank you for having me. But I think with embodying power, with that, it was shown at the beginning of 2018, and I think was right after I had come back towards the latter end of 2017. And I think Saskia, if we're kind of asking the question of the lack of curators, I think that's perhaps not something at the time that I was feeling. I was actually feeling a lack of conversation, of discourse, of peer conversation in some sense. So in many ways, I mean, to put it quite crudely, embodying power came out of a kind of loneliness. In some sense, because at the time I had moved back, and I was loneliness in the context of an artist or an artistic practice. It's my practice my interest as an artist at the time was thinking about the body and thinking about the body and violence and its relationships to systems of power. And I was feeling quite on my own or out in the dark a little bit when I came back. So after some time, I think I was also working at the gallery at Saskia Fernando at the time. But at the time, what I did is I texted a friend and I asked an acquaintance actually at the time, who's now become a very good friend. Her name is Tamara Fernando. She's a wonderful historian. And so I texted her and said, hey, do you want to think about, continuing this conversation about the body, or can we see where it goes? And it was just a point of personal interest. It was much more kind of thinking about it as research, as a way to kind of start having a conversation between other artists who are exploring the same conversation. And that, of course, mushroomed into a show very quickly. As we started reaching out to people and talking about it. And then, to be quite dramatic about it, we did say, we just want to have a conversation about this. And then that kind of became this show called Embodying Power. And the premise of the show was simple. It was Tamara and I looking at sort of conversations in Sri Lankan art and looking at which of those conversations are looking at the body, but particularly in what ways they're looking at the body. So something that we were noticing was at the time that there was an immediate kind of recognition or acknowledgement in Sri Lankan art of the kind of bodily violence, that kind of immediate visceral sense of violence and depicting it, or kind of wrestling with that, particularly as it related to sort of the ethnic and other conflicts that have kind of, been sort of animated Sri Lankan history, also as it related to kind of Sri Lanka's colonial history. But we were kind of at this weird moment where, Hasini, to sort of speak to your question of that having the right to go back or wanting to return to and confront these things, that was rapidly kind of dissipating, or it felt like it was going away from us. So one thing that we wanted to do was think about how do we acknowledge some of those earlier conversations on sort of very visceral, direct kind of bodily violence as animated by conflict, but then push it a little bit further and bring in some new artists who are perhaps thinking about the body and violence as it relates to industry, as it relates to gender, as it relates to the things that might, the kind of violence that happens when there's not as much direct everyday violence kind of happening. So these are just some of the conversations we were interested in. And so the show sort of emerged from there. Of course, a lot of these, the show had a whole host of artists. It was sort of, if I can just pull this up really quickly. Yeah, here we go. I'm just going to read the list out here. But we had work by Shamanti Rajasingham, Firi Rahaman, and Benuri Pereira. We had also work, and the show was divided into various different sections because there were almost contradicting conversations on the body going on in the show. And that's just something that we were quite interested in at the time, is can we kind of look at various ways of looking at the body? Largely because this started from kind of a research interest. We had Isuri Dayaratna, Hashan Kure, Menika Vanderputten, Pushpa Kanthan, Katusa Medusa, and Minal Naomi, Pasan Jasingha, Abdul Halik Aziz, Movindu Binoy, Susiman Rinoshan, Navindri and Praveen Tilakaratna, Navindri Anatung and Praveen Tilakaratna, and Hanusha Somasundaram, all kind of bringing up different perspectives. The show was, of course, quite a simple one. We called it a pop-up show. We hosted it for 3 days. And the idea was simply to ask for, just to get to the practical matters of it, we decided, okay, to fund this show, we will ask 10 people for 10,000 rupees. And that's how we will kind of hire the venue out and do all those other kinds of things. And then what we did is we just worked off of Facebook and just started sharing posts and events and things like that. We didn't have any budget for anything else. And then it was also quite a community sort of endeavor. There was Menika Vanderputten, who had some photographs in the show, whom Dominic Sansoni immediately offered to print it for us as a favor. Somebody else would say, you know what, you need tables for people to gather around, I'll hire that out for you. A friend's, I think, a parent decided, no, you need refreshments, and let me handle the refreshments kind of thing, and then bring that over. And then someone else came with their camera and said, I'll take photographs. And a bunch of our friends said, we'll volunteer, hand out, and talk, invite people for conversations and so on. So it was kind of a community sort of effort because it was happening in such, we were just happening. It was happening on the ground in some sense. But we were quite surprised by the turnout. We had, over those 3 days, just by working off of Facebook, we had, I think, around 380 people visit for this pop-up show. And it's not people that I had perhaps seen at kind of other art gatherings and so on. So that was kind of stuck with me. But with the show in particular, I think there was some really kind of interesting works developed. Benuri Pereira, I should say that this was in the context of the Sapkumal Foundation, which again has a whole other historical kind of relevance there with the 43 group and the impact they've had on Sri Lankan art. So what was kind of something we hadn't anticipated, but then later had to really think through, is what does it mean for these much younger artists to come into this space and be in conversation with the work. So Benuri developed a performance piece called See Me, See You, in which she dressed up in a sari, but had her face wrapped. And she was in one of the rooms in which all of the paintings in that room were portraits of women in saris. And and in that room was also installed a work by Firi Rahaman and Shamanti Rajasingha. And what Benuri did was kind of strike these various poses that often South Asian women would be depicted in paintings or posed in paintings. And it started kind of a really interesting conversation. I'm wondering if I can just share very quickly an image here. Oh, no, don't worry about it. I just don't seem to be able to find it. But so these were some of the conversations. Pasan Jayasinghe developed a set of watercolor drawings that sat in conversation with some of Lionel Wendt photographs. So these were just kind of interesting conversations that emerged from there. And then from that point on, I would say that that sort of conversation or that idea of if my work going on has evolved beyond that point. I'd like to think it has, but I don't think it actually has. In some sense, I keep finding myself going back to that sort of fault line of that show in terms of its research. It's a personal interest, and I want to invite people into that conversation and see what we all have to say about it.
Thank you, Sandev. Yeah, I think that that's what I was trying to point out, in fact, that how you made works, particularly by the 43 group, which is widely acknowledged locally, but related those works to contemporary art pieces, which is something I think that we were observing for the first time in that kind of space. And how those conversations do continue is an incredibly interesting thing. So I look forward to expanding on that and talking about your other roles as we move on. But Sharmini, coming back to you and your work currently at the museum, and from the first exhibition that you presented to the exhibition I believe you're working on now. Can you take us through this specific project? You have presented exhibitions internationally of Sri Lankan contemporary art, but this is your current focus and an incredibly important one in how it has changed the Sri Lankan contemporary scene, a much needed project that has now been established. Can you tell us more about the first exhibition and what you're working on now?
Could you share your screen, Masha? The exhibition was in fact one that started off internationally. So that's quite a nice, I suppose, starting point. It was an exhibition that was commissioned as part of the Dhaka Art Summit, which is held in Bangladesh. And I think a lot of my work and a lot of the support for my work has come from the region. So this was an amazing opportunity to present an exhibition that looked at Sri Lanka. And I think that's a question we could perhaps come back to about to what extent it can represent Sri Lanka, thinking about some of the questions that Hasini raised. What one thing that we haven't really mentioned is art history and Sri Lankan art history. And perhaps part of what Hasini is also talking about is the need to recognize that there are multiple art histories in the country and that they are also not all written, and where they are written and when they're written in Tamil and Sinhala, how as a English pretty much led art scene that we all inhabit, how those histories are made even more invisible. So this exhibition really, I still would say with a question mark, whether or not it represented Sri Lanka. It included artists who resided, who have a connection with Sri Lanka. And I think it brings, all of those questions perhaps to the surface here, because it included 39 artists, of which 23 or so came from Colombo. So in some ways, it was, again, quite a Colombo-centric exhibition. There were 6 who were based outside of Sri Lanka, and 10 that came from different places around the country, Kandy, Puttlam, Galle. And it was chosen as the opening exhibition for the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Sri Lanka, because, in fact, I had persuaded the people who are pretty much the powerhouse behind the museum, who are the museum committee, who are an incredibly dedicated group of people who have really been the ones who have got this entire museum project off the ground. I had persuaded them to come to Dhaka and to see this exhibition. And as a result of them seeing it, when it came to thinking about what would be the opening exhibition, they were not sure about this one initially, but in the end, that was something that they decided to go with. And of course, the opportunity as a curator to represent an exhibition comes with, like any touring exhibition, an opportunity to expand, to add, to edit, etc. And I tried to take that opportunity. But I should begin perhaps by bracketing what I'm talking about by saying that the exhibition came together through various strands of my research. And so one of the most important things, I suppose, to highlight in this exhibition was it wasn't a list of artists. It was more, for me, and what I wanted to present was a list of artworks. So I suppose that then goes back to, again, this writing, this telling, this exhibiting of art history. And where I could, I introduced a few extra or additional artworks. But the space in which we also had to work with was brought limitations. And we had the opportunity to launch the MMCA at the Colombo Innovation Tower, thanks to the sponsorship of the Academy of Design. And without them, we would never have been able to launch. And when we opened, I suppose, this exhibition, when I saw it here again, presented in Sri Lanka, it had a very different sort of impact for me, because it was going now to be visited by people that were familiar with the contexts, were familiar with the histories. And so I suppose in the exhibition, if you just go back one slide, what I wanted to try and do was think about how we look at an artwork. And in the slide before this, if you don't mind going back, Marcia, I had a chance here to, we've mentioned the 43 group already in this conversation, and they're always mentioned, and yet I always feel like we just really don't know enough about them, who they are as individuals, who they are, what their individual practices are made up of. And here was an opportunity. I wanted to show just a very small grouping of works where here are four works rather, by W.J.G. Beeling, and they're his photographs rather than his paintings. And it was an opportunity to show them in the context of perhaps making a note here that Beeling is taking photographs, and one of his subjects on the far left is Lionel Wendt, and it's Wendt that in the received art history is recognized as perhaps the sort of founding figure in terms of photographic modern art history in Sri Lanka. But in this room, as you see in the next slide, what was great was to be able to put work by W.J.G. Beeling with, if you go to the next slide, you can see work by contemporary artists who were also, in the case here, you see in the foreground, Anoli Pereira's works, and in the background, Amar Sekhar's works. And both of these artists are also dealing with and looking at the history of photography and rethinking it. And in the same room, when we go to the next slide, I was able to put into conversation a work which is by Colette, and it's another portrait of Lionel Wendt. So we have W.J.G. Beeling's photograph of Wendt on the other side, and here's Wendt again. So an exhibition like this was really about the artworks, and it's interesting, just as an aside, but what we had to do is secure these through loans, and if we couldn't, and this did happen, someone said, well, just get another work by that artist, and it wasn't really that simple, because it wasn't just any other work by Colette. It had to be this work, because it was the work by Colette showing the portrait of Lionel Wendt that was necessary to show within this particular grouping of works. But aside from, I suppose, the interest in the curatorial interests that I'm speaking about here, one of the challenges of this exhibition, as you see when you go to the next slide, was about activating it, developing an audience. Hasini's mentioned, we have over 100 museums, but I think one thing maybe we would all perhaps agree with is that they could be doing so much more in terms of getting the audiences to come in and to engage with what's on the walls. And you can see that portrait of Wendt right there in the background. And Wendt was, yes, he was the central figure of the 43 group, the group of modernist artists. But here in the foreground, we brought together, as was the case with our public program, as many artist talks as we could. And here was a talk happening between two people that are very closely associated with the Tirtha Artist Collective. And we had this amazing conversation with Prasanna here, animated in his blue shirt, talking with Pushpa and Pradeep, recounting and retelling the stories that relate to the work behind them. And in the next slide, you'll just see how we also, brought in other artists Shanathanan here. And in fact, he told me this was the first time he'd ever actually been invited to give an artist talk. And we had, I think, over 120 people to this talk. And the next slide also shows another artist talk that we had. Again, very different kind of audience coming in. This was Stephen Champion talking very candidly, telling stories about how he came into photography. And I think one of the things I suppose to say about maybe this exhibition as well is when you think about how to engage audiences, it's not just through the artists. And if you go to the next slide, what we really put a lot of work into was a couple of things. One was working as much as we could trilingually, and that was through the printed matter, through our social media, through the talks that we gave, and the staff, our staff, and you see Sandev here, who was busy. I mean, it was around the clock doing tours, taking people around. And this was something as well that for many people, if you go to the next slide, one of the other people in the team, Promoter, who's assistant curator of education, she'd never done this kind of work before. And I think there again, it's just to highlight, what we need to do more of, as well as, talk about curating, is train curators and think about what kind of training they require. There are programs out there, but what are the specific kinds of training that is right for the contexts, again, that are so relevant, so kind of situated in Sri Lanka. And in the last slide, it's just to show you one of the other things that we tried out was, because we were then just a staff of 4 people. There's only so many tours a day that you can do. But what we tried out was something called the Visitor Educator Program. And we had 28 people who spoke Sinhala and Tamil and English. And we got them involved in doing these kinds of tours, which might be just 10 minutes or 15 minutes to slightly longer conversations with members of the public or schools. And here you see, here's Hasini, one of our VEs, engaged in conversation there. And we tried this out, as we did with many things, I suppose, to wrap up on maybe what is perhaps there with the first show. It was really a testing ground. And we did launch something that has a much bigger vision, of course, behind it, but we have a long way to go. And I think in recognizing where we need to go, we need to put down foundations and foundations that are looking at art history, looking at research, looking at the training, looking at the capacity building needed in our sector that would be of benefit not just to the MMCA, but to other organizations, including the national institutions in the country, as well as the private ones. But I think what the MMCA is quite, I suppose, quite openly doing is saying we are trying things out. We don't have all the answers right now, but we are really going to try and do things so that we can test the ground and perhaps think in public with the people who will use this museum long into the future. And ultimately, I guess, when I think back to the first photo I showed you of me, taking a photo when I was 23, but people should see this museum and they should see our industry as an industry that they can and should be able to get jobs in, and jobs that are real jobs, not project to project, which is, again, another, I suppose, characteristic of the working environment here. For many curators, it's project to project. So that's, I suppose, one of the things that I hope that the MMCA starts to identify, that there's a generation of people, whether they're designers, whether they're people interested in PR, whether they're in-counts people, but they want to work in a museum, and this might be that environment for them.
For sharing this exhibition and the fantastic work of the museum. Your point, actually, on what the point that you ended with does bring me to Hasini, and something that you mentioned in the first question that I asked you about encouraging curatorial work as a subject. I'd like to ask you how you work on this specifically. And in addition to that, also ask you a second question, because your work clearly focuses on archiving, memory, peace building, and heritage management. How important is that focus for you in the work that you do, and how important do you think that focus is for curating in general? If you can answer those two questions.
I think there are lots of different ways of being a curator, and I think all of us come to it from different places. But in the end, a lot of us also speak the same language in the end. There's a lot of resonance that I find in the work that Sharmini has done, in the work that Sandev has done, and the work that I'm doing. So we may come from different backgrounds, different approaches, but in the end, we are all rooted in our cultural context, and we speak to that, and the issues that we struggle with are pretty much the same. I mean, I'm 100% with what Sharmini is saying about the need for curatorial training, all of that. So I think it's just that personally, my own background and practice makes me a certain, approach a certain topic from a certain point of view. And that's just one way of being a curator. For me, a curator is somebody who gets passionate about a certain idea and digs that deeper, does that research, puts in that passion, and brings together a story and a new light, and then follow up with that to share and contribute to some kind of a discussion that's out there. For me, that's the way I approach it as a curator. It's not a definition of what a curator should be, but that's the way I approach the work that I'm doing. So I think it all blends in with the personal vision that you have for the work that you're doing. And a lot of us wear very different hats at the moment. And that also happens, it has its pros, because then it also becomes a very dynamic practice, because you come from different standards, different disciplines. So it's interdisciplinary, it's dynamic. So those are the pros that I see to it. But it also has cons, because like Sharmini says, not now how many of us can afford to be a full-time curator? So at the moment, one of the biggest issues about becoming a curator is that only the privileged can be curators in Sri Lanka, right? So you cannot pursue it if you come from a different social bracket, simply for the economics behind it. So that's what Sharmini was talking about when she was saying, how do we make this an attractive option for young people to be curators full time, to see that really as a profession. And again, I just feel that there are different ways of doing it, and I don't think my way of doing it is any special, but I just approach it from trying to always contextualize and speak to the needs that are there surrounding us, and trying to always bring us back to ourselves and ask some critical questions through the work that I do. So that is, I think that is for each and every curator to decide for himself or herself what drives their practice as a curator. So for me, it's really about building bridges, exploring the margins of certain things that we always want to discuss it, whatever the topic is. And see, I mean, Sandev is doing exactly that with his work on embodying power. I think Shayari is doing exactly that with the work that she's doing at the Jeff Brower Trust. So we are all trying to do in our different angles, exploring the margins, digging the hidden stories, bringing that and presenting. So for me, I always try to approach it from a perspective of how do we widen our circle to include more and more people, more and more languages, more and more art histories, more and more artists. And not just in terms of being locally inclusive, but also globally inclusive, because there's a lot of resonance that I find in working across boundaries and borders and transnationally. I mean, I want to quickly mention one example from one of the projects. I mean, stuff that I love, the reason why I do the kind of work that I do is, like all of you, I also work with Hanusha Somasundaram. I featured also her in one of the exhibitions we did last January in 2020, just before COVID happened, and where we brought together 6 different artists in an exhibition called Recurrence. And I was really moved by Hanusha because I found that she is really based in her community, her own memory, her own experience, and she was powerfully using her visuals to do that. And then through working with these 7 different countries, I came across an artist in Brazil, Tiago Santana, whose work is extremely similar. So Hanusha works with tea and tea bags to talk about her background, because she grew up in a tea plantation, and Tiago Santana grew up in a sugar plantation, and he uses sugar to talk about absolutely the same topics, so his works, if you go to www.wammuseum.org, you can see the comparison between the 2 people, and how they are really addressing legacies of colonialism, their own memories and their own experience, and how that is shaping their artistic expression in such similar ways. Although they are speaking 2 different languages, they don't know about each other. They haven't even met each other yet. They can't speak to each other because of the language barriers, 9,000, 10,000 miles apart. But the fact that when we really try to cross those borders and bridge the divides that are there internally within our own context, but also externally and globally, we find amazing resonance and amazing common ground. And for me, that's what inspires me in my curatorial work, to search for those resonance, to search for those building bridges and links that brings us sort of together.
Thank you, Hasini. Thank you for sharing that interesting information on one of your many projects, but also for raising very, very valid points in this conversation. I'd like to move back to you, Shayari, and talk a little bit more about how your work as architect has influenced your role as curator, and also ask you about this transition for the foundation in focusing on curating and the collections, and how that experience has been for you.
So as I mentioned, I think I have always been interested in this, in the kind of histories of objects and places. And I think that lens, Hasini spoke of the kind of questions that we each bring to our practice. And for me, I've always been interested in questions of medium and questions of context, and then the way they feed back into the way we engage with art and with architecture. And I think that at the Trust, the collections, they were always meant to be, after they were no longer, the paintings in Geoffrey Bawa's home, they were always meant to be shared in this way. And I think that goal was there, right, from his own time, where we open up the collection, we are able to use them use those objects as a resource for scholarship and for understanding our own recent history. So I think the way that kind of ties into architecture is really interesting when you look at the specificities of Bawa's practice, where art and architecture were very closely intertwined. But I think also looking at his practice as an architect, I think he had a very long career during, kind of starting right after Sri Lanka gains independence, but then through layers and layers of turmoil in our recent history. And that practice somehow persevered. And I think when we look, when I consider my kind of life before I moved back and here, I think there's so many limitations and there are so many restrictions that we have. But I think there's a kind of pragmatism that architecture requires, and maybe even an optimism, so that for example, right after we launched Power 100, we had the Easter tags, followed less than a year later by COVID. And I guess we never, as I said, we never intended to have any kind of online programming, that because we've been so focused on these ideas of place and objects in certain contexts. And we did ask ourselves, do we just, pause? Because of course we didn't know it was going to be a 2-year or ongoing situation. But I think we quickly kind of looked back at our main, intentions with this, which was that we really believe that more than ever, in those kinds of contexts, the place of art and architecture is incredibly valuable. It is, as so many of the others have mentioned, it is a place of bringing people together, of creating empathy and understanding and opening up our worlds. So we felt it was really important to keep going. And I think that's also how we want to use these collections, really to open up these questions. I think the kind of architectural background that I have, and many of my colleagues do as well, is I guess it allows us to be quite responsive, and we do have to wear many hats in this work, as I think we all do, and it certainly helps with that. But I think we increasingly operate in places where we are bringing these different disciplines together, and it's not about being an architect or working on only architectural work. And I think that's what will be really interesting with when we open this exhibition on the archives, to see they are about places, and often places that all of us in Sri Lanka know very well. But how does that building then relate to a drawing? And I think certainly my personal way of approaching those drawings is I look at them and I'm like, do they tell you what an architecture drawing should tell you, which is how to build this building? And with Bauer's practice, quite often they don't. But I can look at them and say, well, what do they tell us about a place? And I think each of us would come to those drawings with different questions and different insights. But I think that's really the exciting thing about having a repository like an architectural archive.
Thank you, Shayari. That's incredibly interesting. And I think that everyone here in this conversation does have such a wonderful ability to work with the cross sections of different industries. And I feel that you've highlighted a very important point, that when you do curate, it is about having this sort of fluidity between an understanding of which strengthens the role of curator. And it's so very interesting to learn a little bit more in depth of how you approached your work in this particular project, which can be accessed online. Some really interesting conversations that I think you just presented as well for the gift that can be accessed via the website. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Sandev, I'd like to ask you the final question. In my first question, we focus on one particular exhibition, but we discussed, I think Hasini and Shayari also mentioned wearing many hats. And when I introduced you, I think that was clear. You're an artist, you're a curator, and you're working on a very interesting residency program, as well as part of a collective. Can you talk a little bit about how this, when you look at your role as curator, how these different hats influence that role, and give us a little bit more insight into your particular understanding of it?
I guess in some ways to talk about these many different hats and the influence that they have on my work as in the curatorial or curatorial on them. I guess it's quite helpful for me, at least, to step back a little bit, just to speak a little bit about when I studied or was interested particularly in when I had left here, when I was in university, was particularly interested in sort of a little bit like some philosophy and social theory and things like that. And that was on one side. And on the other side, what I was working on was I was training as an artist and designer. But my training was particularly classical. And my training is classical as an artist. So something that I was quite, I guess, struggling with at the time was, on one end, kind of all this whole theoretical framework in politics, also coming from a kind of really intense activist background at the time, and struggling to bridge the gap between that and sort of the fine art training that I had, or the classical training that I had. And so it kind of, I guess, it was affecting my perspective of the way I was maybe living in art or thinking about art. That is until I started, I worked at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, in the education department there. And that was a really sort of wonderful place. And I think I started seeing some really fantastic things happen there, which is coming from this really intense, I guess, activist background or fine art background. I was seeing that a museum space or an institutional space that had artwork in it became or was being used as a space for conversation around issues like race and justice and gender and class, and sort of some of these really kind of complex and hard conversations. And so for me, I think that seeing working in a museum space, and also my job there was to host these conversations within that kind of gallery space, centering artwork, centering multiple artworks perhaps that had been curated or put together, and invite conversations. And I left there with, I had many conversations, but particularly some things that have stuck with me is, back in 2015 and 2016, what it meant to speak about race in America at that time, and the kind of conversations that the museum space or the gallery space or the kind of institutional space or the space, right? Just that architecture, that there's art here in a show, that facilitated, I think had quite a deep impact on me. And so I guess coming back here and then continuing to work on these small exhibitions, work with an artist collective like the Packet, work on sort of this project, which I'll speak about shortly, and work with the museum has really kind of, I think, that experience has impacted my curatorial work also. In the sense in which I'm always finding myself quite uncomfortable with the label of curator. But having said that, I think if we think, like Shayari was saying, if we think about sort of that origin of the word curator, which is to care for, I like to think about a slightly different definition, pretty much the same, but that is to worry about. And I think for me, something that I'm really interested in is what it means to worry about conversations, or worry about kind of conversations that can invite people in, to have some really hard, sometimes complex conversations that contradict, that are tough conversations to have, that perhaps it isn't easy to have when you're writing an essay or more direct activist kind of sense. So I think for me, in that, what influences my curatorial role or my artistic role is, what does it mean to host these conversations that invite people to bring their very specific social and political context or their specific moments into a space together, and open those questions out. And so I think if I've overused the word today, I feel like I've overused the word conversation. But I think that's really kind of the crux of how I think of, or I like to think of, the kind of curatorial practice that I'm interested in. And I see that happening in the museum with 100,000 Small Tales. With the work, I came in after the show had been researched, but we were thinking about, again, how do the walls of this space, how can they, and the artworks in them, how can they talk to each other? What happens when we bring people in and invite them into the conversation that these artworks themselves are having? And then how can we look at one artwork and talk about how Sri Lanka is perhaps a classist and has so much economic inequality. And at the same time, look at that same work and talk about resilience, and talk about what it means for a country to have maybe experienced so many things, but also find resilience in that. And how can a single work do that? And how how does that complicate our discourse? I think with the work in the packet, it's different, but it's thinking about a group of friends and exploring a kind of mutual curiosities that we have and relying on each other for conversation. And art is the thing that comes out of it. And then in my role, perhaps there's this other project, which I'm working on now, which is a word where yesterday and tomorrow are the same word, kal. And it's a transoceanic project between Berlin, Karachi, Colombo, and Los Angeles. And it's really bringing together young artists who are interested in feminist, anti-racist, anti-fascist, and queer explorations in artwork. And so again, here, conversation enters back in. It's maybe, it looks different, the structure is different, but when I'm thinking about it curatorially, it's thinking about what does it mean, almost a quote to speak about Virginia Woolf and what she talks about, this room of one's own, to work with artists directly and create a space in which, especially young artists, and where we can nurture or grow together as we're talking about their artwork very specifically, as we're taking them on field trips and having direct conversations with their work and kind of facilitating that. So those, I guess, in some ways, to really ask the question of what is the curatorial and how does the curatorial affect the artistic practice? I think there's something else that affects all of those things for me. And that's, I guess, a function or a method or a methodology. And then methodology, I think, is mainly kind of a methodology of conversation, I think, that centers where I've found myself, begrudgingly or not, as a curator.
Thank you, Sandev. I'm actually going to hop forward to the first question based on your answer. And Shania is asking, do you see yourself primarily as an artist or vice versa? Do you see your roles as separate, or do they feed off each other? And how has your work with the MMCA and curatorial work in general impacted your own art practice?
That's a tough one. That's a question that perhaps plagues me all day. But thanks, Shania, for that question. I think if I was to answer it again, I think going back to that sort of, there's something else that influences both my work as an artist and both my work as a curator. And it's hard for me sometimes to find an in-between. I think with the MMCA, it's perhaps more strictly looking at work, like working with conservation, working with caring directly for work, right? Exhibition making, conservation, taking care of work, and education and pedagogical activities. But I think that influences a lot of the work that perhaps we do with the packet, or the kind of posture that I adopt perhaps with the residents of the CUL program that I'm working on, which is to think about if in the museum context, we are caring for work and caring for the conservation and the exhibition making and the education around work. In these other contexts, in these collaborative contexts as artists, how are we caring for each other's work? And how are we kind of being supporters or conversation partners or peers in that context, I guess. Sorry if that was vague, but yeah.
Not at all. Thank you, Sandev, for so candidly sharing so much insight into how you approach all these different roles and sharing that so beautifully. In fact, the way you put your approach to curating is very lovely to listen to, because it does share a lot of insight in a completely different way. I'm going to bring Halik onto into the conversation to ask Hasini his question in person. Halik, I'm just unmuting you. I think we're having a bit of an issue with connecting Halik, who has also shared his question via the Q&A. So I'll just read it out to you, Hasini. Halik writes, this question is in relation to the World Art and Memory Museum. I'm wondering about your thoughts on how art can directly affect social cohesion in post-war Sri Lanka, especially in a context when it has to compete with formats such as memes, and that have proven to be very effective in identity formations that are sometimes very negative to our social makeup. How have you seen this play out on the context of WAMM in terms of competing for eyeballs?
Yeah, thanks, Halik. I think your question really highlights the point I'm trying to make in terms of how we really need to be responding to what's happening around us, and how we really need to root our practice in the context that we are living in, and being relevant to what's going on around us. And by that, you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, I mean, I would like to actually start by sharing a dilemma that I've had in my work. That is the moment you go out of the capital to start thinking about the visual literacy, the level of visual literacy in our country, and the way it's formed. And it's different. Just like Sharmini said, we have different multiple art histories in this country, and a lot of the work, the work of the artists and the way people read art is very different. Now, for me, as a person who has also worked with other forms of art, like performance art and literature and storytelling, etc., I've always found taking art exhibitions out there was where I felt most amount of gaps in people, although I thought, I mean, drama always has to be bogged down by language barrier, right? And art is a universal visual language. So it should immediately, be able to talk to different audiences, but it doesn't, So I think one is about working on our art education out there, in increasing art literacy and visual literacy in our country, which needs a lot of work, I think, on one hand. So that's one point I want to bring out, that we need to look into that. How do we really increase the visual literacy on one hand? And on the other hand, I see a need for our artists to engage with the emerging visualities that are happening because of TikTok and all these memes that we are talking about, right? So how do curators, but also artists, engage with this emerging, changing landscape of visuality that's surrounding us? And since you're talking about WAM, I'm going to give you another example. I wish I could. I mean, I wish I could actually share the image of it. You remind me of Khaled Hafez's work. Khaled is an artist from Egypt. He's also our curator for the portfolio. He has a wonderful series called Batman. Batman going to bed, Batman this. I mean, it's a whole series of work where he's basically taking the figure of Batman and the hieroglyphs in Egyptian tombs, which is something that like all Egyptians are really rooted in, the figures of Anubis and Sekhmet and all the Egyptian gods that you grow up knowing. Yeah. And he juxtaposes, he brings these two figures together, right? So this Batman and Anubis, they look the same, even their profile looks the same. And the artist really brings this together and plays with it, and brings the tradition and the modern and the two worlds that are completely separate together to have a conversation. And by doing that, by being able to bridge that gap between the emerging visualities that comes through pop culture or social media, and connecting it with a language that all Egyptians are really familiar with, he is able to address something that you are trying to ask. So I don't have an answer for that, but I can only share my own observations and learnings. I think we need to try and do that in terms of relating both ways and reaching out both ways. Also by working on the audience side, trying to reach out and then have a conversation about visual literacy. And also with curators and artists, we need to do a lot of work in trying to address how do we respond to these emerging visual literacies. How do we, for instance, get trained in Britain and US and UK in modern art and all of that, and come back and start practicing it in Sri Lanka and start talking to audiences who don't perhaps speak the same language that we do, right? So I think that's where it is. And I think like it's not one-sided answer. We have to explore multiple routes and multiple ways of doing it, and go back into our own visual history that we bring. And I think, Halik, you do it amazingly in your own practice, and by responding to your own community and everything that's going on. There's no easy answer to it, but I hope I, in some way, try to address what you are trying to say.
Thank you, Hasini. The next question is from Manika van der Poorten, who's asking you, Sharmini, could you say something about the difference, change, or progression you have seen over the years in terms of audience engagement with contemporary visual art?
I wish it had changed more, I suppose, in terms of the engagement beyond the English-speaking audience, particularly. I think, though, it has changed, and I put forward a couple of things that maybe are behind that change, and I think a lot has happened with regard to artists who are being recognized from coming from outside of Colombo. And that has been huge, I feel, in terms of bringing forward just practices that would have maybe not just added, but I think have recalibrated what people thought was the entire scene. I think it's brought about some tensions as well, but I think sometimes it's really good to have those things. It's not just one or two people that can do well here. It's difficult, I think, in a small context or rather a small population as we are, where these things are all competing for very limited platforms of attention, which brings me to the next, I think, changing element in perhaps what I've seen over the years is, of course, the way that social media has brought about quite huge shifts. I mean, just Halik here on the call, his work came to the attention of perhaps I think Saskia initially through his social media presence, and that he took to social media and used it and kind of dissected it and understood it strategically. I think those are certainly they've changed a lot of what's perhaps got out to audiences. I do think there's a huge way to go though, and that happens with more artists, that happens with more curators. Like Hasini says, everyone comes to it and brings to it very different kinds of practices. And I think we need more still. I think the audiences also for art, contemporary art and modern art have been, I think, justifiably sometimes, really disinterested, because we as people in the industry haven't done enough to make it interesting for them. I don't want to point the finger out. I think we need to do much more in terms of bringing and developing our audiences, thinking about all the different ways that you can do that, and that lies with us. in a way to those that collect art. I think that circle has expanded, but I still say that there's just this overall lack of, I think, knowledge about art. And the one thing, is sometimes, why would I pay this much for this? And that art should be valued not just monetarily, but in terms of its place in a society that is thinking about itself in a very reflexive way, and that artists have played a huge role in that, and the histories that maybe we haven't really been prepared to talk about are also those histories that need to start being talked about, however difficult that is. But even, if it's not just talking about the bigger names, just to encourage scholarship and encourage curators to go out there and put together shows. And however that might come about, because those are going to be things that change the audiences for what we do. And I think lastly, it's about having so many different kinds of levels of activity going on. So I'd say the Columboscope is really vital. It's part of an ecosystem which comes about every when there's not a pandemic, every 2 years. It's something that engages internationally. I think the works that go on in the projects that Sandev has been doing, the amazing work that I feel Shayari and the Trust have brought about in terms of what essentially a private foundation can achieve with a collection is really has been a game changer, and that should be something that I hope other similar organizations should look to, not to imitate, not to copy, but just to take a cue from, to take a page from out of that book. To expand, to think about things where we're not just, same old, or it's, the 3 or 4 usual suspects. And I think we're getting there. I think we're in a really good place where we're having these kinds of conversations, which is also a first. And I think that kind of camaraderie, with everyone here, Sandev is just an amazing assistant curator to work with. I learned so much through working with him. Hasini's work is, again, just, thank God that there's Hasini working and doing the things she's doing. And as I've said, Shayari, the program that you put together and the team that you've kind of had to train around you has been exemplary for towards what other similar collections-based organizations can aspire to. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Menaka.
Thank you, Sharmini. We have, I'm going to try one more time to bring on the question, Anuji, in person. In just a second. Yep. I think we have her online with us. Hi, Anuji.
Hi, everyone. I want to first say that I'm so delighted to have spent my afternoon with all of you. And it's been inspiring, it's been intelligent, it's been concise, just wonderful to know that you're all out there. And I think I'm just in the outer orbit of the art world. And it's really heartening to know that I think the future looks very bright. So I've been kind of furiously note-taking because I'm quite the amateur. And I kind of wanted to summarize a couple of things before I put my question to Shayari, or my questions to Shayari. I've gathered now that we're living in a time where we have a lot of experienced curators around, which is very heartening, and that you're all, part of a growing presence on the local art scene, clearly. And also, I think importantly, you're not just bringing skills and expertise, you're bringing a huge amount of varied experience and global reach. I think that's something that you've all kind of touched on in various ways. And I think that's really important for all of us. I think, though, if I'm honest, I think the local art world mostly calls on the expertise of curators, I think, in a very limited way still. And most often, I would say it's kind of late, or it's a sort of light touch, as it were, to kind of polish up and put things out there to the public, or as you all kind of mentioned, in a kind of archival, behind the scenes sort of work that you do. And to me, it seems like, in a kind of sporting analogy, it would seem like whilst we have the full team, perhaps we're putting curators in a defense kind of role, or perhaps you're even still on the benches, rather than being in an offensive place where you can all do more for the art world. And so now, coming to the Bauer Trust, I think that, you know, it's got quite a long history of influence in the world of architecture. But I would say it has a comparatively short, or in a comparatively short time frame, and possibly with sort of the same resources just deployed differently, it's reinvented itself to make what I think are really significant roads in the global art scene, as it were. So my questions are as follows. Has the Trust demonstrated how the scope and impact of projects is greater if a curator can be engaged as part of developing a wider vision than just those of what a project needs? Do you think it's more impactful for curators to be positioned, therefore, at the forefront of envisioning and being part of co-producing projects in the future, so that we can maximize the opportunities that we have and the resources that we have to generate more impact for the wider art world? And finally, does it mean that we all have an opportunity, maybe responsibility, to move forward by using more intelligently the resources we have in our midst, like the curators, to create new kinds of collaborations and new kinds of projects? So you can answer one or all, or just say something in response to that.
Thanks, Sanji. I'm pretty sure I've already conflated the three questions, so I'll just try. I think that one of the things we try to do quite consciously is position ourselves as working collectively. And I think if you look at the history of architecture very specifically, especially architecture in the kind of modern period, there's a lot of single authorship. And if there's one thing we know about architecture, it's that it's absolutely a huge collective, collaborative enterprise. So certainly the way we work at the Trust is very wide. We work very collaboratively. I think from the trustees to our staff at Bank, we're all working together. And I don't say this in this kind of naive, it's true. It's how without any one of those pieces, we could not do the projects we do, or even look after the collections the way we need to. And I think when we talk about the role of curators, so it's work that comes with a lot of responsibility. I think a lot of the others on this panel have spoken about the kinds of conversations that we're trying to have about, which are the difficult conversations to have. And I think I really responded to what Hasini said about also us having quite a limited visual literacy if we look at the country as a whole. And that's certainly something we've found as well. And how do we open this up in a way that is accessible and in a way that can be engaged with, which also feels like we are coming with open arms rather than, top down, I guess. And so I think that the role of the curator is, the way I see it, often, I'll say in the context of the trust, there's a lot of how do we open these conversations up? And we are very interested in not just having them internally, but really having them not just even in Colombo, but widely. And I think you do need to have a certain amount of experience with how to handle conversations like that, and how do you effectively then bring out that material and make it so that you are bringing out a collection or an object or a building, and then using that as the point of engagement. I think there's also, I think what I'm trying to say is there is an expertise that is required. I don't, we were talking about memes and everyone's a curator now meme. It's, I don't think everyone is a curator. I think it requires some training. But I do think that we are very committed to that training, and we're very committed to widening the amount of curators we have. And I mean, I've been, so I started mid-2018 at the Trust, and I was a one-person department at the beginning. In 9 months, we were 3 people. And very quickly, we knew that having a cohort of interns and very young graduates was important. And that was also how I started off. And so for me, it felt like a very natural way to build a generation of people engaged in this discipline. And I've been so heartened that in 2019 to 2021, when we do our internship calls now, I think we've gone from like 5 to 6 applicants to like 60, 80, which is incredible. And increasingly, I'm just amazed at the amount of awareness of what we're doing, which I think is really heartening. And I do think suggests that we are looking at, we're talking about a 2-year period of having works, but I think that is the importance of saying, here's an installation, or here's an exhibition. And like Sharmini said, it's not then passively engaged with, but we talk about it together, and we meet the artists, we talk about process. And when we do that, I think we very quickly start opening up the parts of this discipline, which is quite varied. Did I answer your question? I think I might have left out some parts, but I'm happy to.
Thank you, Anuji, for coming on to ask a question. We have a few more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I have to say that as moderator, it was very difficult to cut any of you short, because you've been talking about such interesting topics and projects. So thank you so much to all of you for being a part of this conversation. I think it is something that definitely needs a part 2. But thank you again. Thank you everyone who logged on to listen to the conversation. We will be sharing it via the channel on our website of Saskia Fernando Gallery, and sharing it with all of those of you who registered for the talk. Thank you again, everyone. Take care.
Nations Trust Bank Private Banking is the epitome of elite banking. With its exclusive privileges devoted to providing just the right balance between financial success and lifestyle, our private banking members richly deserve. A financial solution dedicated to excellence, with an unparalleled array of products and services that enrich, enhance, and empower success. A financial solution focused on wealth creation, lifestyle, and the establishment of legacy. A legacy of priority, a legacy of abundance, a legacy much desired. Creating a legacy that's timeless.